Sin, if you bless us, we can begin. So I was asked to speak at this meeting, and I wasn't really sure what to talk about. Part of the concern that I had was, I thought, if I'm going first, maybe we need to set the table a little bit. Maybe there needs to be some sort of context for how we understand relationships, attachments, addictions, how we understand coming together and pursuing something like marriage versus friendship or just somebody who's an acquaintance, and the way that sin can affect these things, can drown them, or the eradication of sin, the entrance of Christ into our lives, can enlighten these things. So I came back to a topic, anybody who knows me, a few of you do, I talk about the passions all the time. I basically don't talk about anything else anymore. And one passion in particular is acedia that I won't talk very much about today, but like if you've ever heard my name, it's attached to those things. The reason to discuss the passions and to think about relationships is to think about the reason why our relationships don't work. Why we find ourselves running into problems with our friends. Why we find that people at work get on our nerves excessively. Why, when it comes to pursuing a spouse, we feel really charged up and excited and we met somebody new and we go on a few dates and everything's great, and then like it fizzles out and you say things like we don't have any chemistry, or it just didn't work, or I wasn't feeling it, or whatever. And the church fathers give us a map for how we understand these basic things that seem to afflict us in our relationships, both to each other and to God and even within ourselves. And so I'm going to give you this basic roadmap, God willing, and hopefully then when Andrew speaks later, he'll give you a real talk, and you guys can benefit from that all the more so. So for me, when we talk about the passions, I want to just first say, let's be on the same page when it comes to talking about sin. Many of us hear the word sin and we use it so often that we don't think about what we're saying anymore. We don't go back to the model that the fathers have given us of saying this is what sin is doing to your humanity or to your relationship. So we're going to start with that. We'll close with what the passions actually are and what the fathers suggest to us the cure of our soul is, so that we can understand how it is we can be real with one another and we can no longer be controlled by those things that nag at us. And I will eventually define this word, because some of you hear passion and think something totally different than what I'm saying today and what the tradition has said. The first thing that I think is interesting to consider is even the way we talk about seeing each other or about seeing reality is different than the ancients. So today, if I sat you down for a grade 11 physics class and said, let's do optics, you know, the way we think of things is the light hits a thing, the thing hits your eye, you see it, you perceive it, that's it. Interestingly, the ancients didn't think about vision like this at all. They thought about vision in a way that wasn't just relevant to physics, but was relevant to every aspect of their life. One way we see this is actually in the gospel. So our Lord says, the lamp of the body is the eye. If therefore your eye is good, and this is the Greek word here, haplos, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If therefore the light that is in you is darkness, how great is that darkness? Now, the English translators, ever since the King James Version, have, if your eye is good. If you know any Greek, haplos is not the word good. It doesn't mean that at all. If you wanted to translate this, and some Arabic translations actually still have it closer to the Greek, the real word in English would be simple. Anybody ever come across this if your eye is simple? Basit, in Arabic we would say. No? Just empty stares, it's okay. So, what would it mean for the Lord to say that the eye could be simple? Because you and I, today, unfortunately, in the modern West, we hear simple, we think that guy's an idiot. Oh, he's a simple farmer, we mean he's dumb. We don't mean he's like something fancy, right? When the word simple is used here, it's directly contrasted with being compounded or being a mixture. Anybody here did chemistry in university? Show of hands. Show me you're alive. Okay, good. I just need to make sure nobody's asleep yet. So if you're thinking in chemistry terms, in the technical world of chemistry, a simple substance is when you have only one thing. What's in the jar? Just water. Nothing else is mixed in it. Right? If you're thinking of a compound, I don't know, put some lemon in the water, let's say. Now you have two things together. So what the Lord here is saying is that if your eye is uncompounded, if it's not tainted with other things, if there are not other attachments that come with how you see the world. This is relevant, and this picture is here for a reason, because the way the ancients, whether you're talking about the church fathers, the time of Jesus, or even like Plato and the philosophers, the way they thought about vision was that the way you see is not that light hits a thing and then the light gets into your eye and you see it. They thought that you projected something out at the thing and then that bounced back to you. So say, okay, well, what does that mean, right? And you can see this in biblical phrases like talking about how Jacob's vision, Isaac's vision is dim. He's of dim eye, right? So that he can't see. When you hear that, you might think, oh well, we're smarter. We don't think that anymore. But what the tradition has always taught is that what you see is dictated by what you're attached to, the thing that directs your vision. If you wear a certain lens, that's how you perceive the reality. If you see the world as a place to become rich and powerful, then suddenly everybody becomes an opportunity, not a person, not a God-given gift, right? If you're controlled by the power of lust over your vision, everything you encounter is an opportunity to satisfy your desire. Everybody you encounter is an opportunity. And so how the ancients understood is to say, like, what you're looking through, what you're seeing with, directly affects how you see. That's why the Lord can say, if your eye is simple, your body's full of light. But if your eye is dark, if you don't see reality as God made it, then you don't see anything. You'll be full of darkness. All you'll see is sin. Think of the example, if you took a young Syriac youth, nice, beautiful, Orthodox young man, and you put him on the street and he sees a homeless guy. And you also put a self-made billionaire, rich guy on the street and he sees the same homeless guy. The hope, God willing, is that the Orthodox person is going to see his brother. He's going to see Christ whom he is meant to serve. In that you have done it to the least of my brethren, you've done it to me, right? It might be the case that the exact same man is seen by the self-made millionaire as a guy who's lazy, who didn't understand opportunity, who didn't work hard enough, who just is feeding off of taxes, whatever. You can imagine how the script would go. And the point is, it's the same poor man on the side of the road. It's two different visions of it. Because how we see, what we perceive, is directly affected by what we are controlled by. So we don't understand this anymore because we don't think of vision as coming from me out and then back. But that's how the ancients taught, which is why this biblical phrase is here. It's why the Lord tells them, if you have a broken eye, if you don't see properly, then your body is full of darkness. But if your eye is light, if all you see is Christ, then you see properly. Then you perceive the person differently. Then when somebody wrongs you, suddenly you understand their circumstance instead of saying that guy's a jerk. Then instead of being attached to winning this argument that I'm having with this person who I'm engaged to or married to or whatever phase of your relationship you're in, instead of seeing it as like, she's stupid, she doesn't get it, it's like, maybe I could lead by example and lay down my opinion. All of that is affected by how we see. Which is why I thought talking about the passions could be a good way to start a conversation about relationship, about attachment, about growing near to someone or other. So if you go back in terms of talking about sin, and you want to know, where did this come from? What does all this do? How do we understand all of these things? You start with Genesis, right? You start with the text that you've probably gotten through a few times, because everybody, New Year's resolution, we're going to read the Bible, and you get to about Genesis 6 or 7, and a genealogy hits in a few chapters, and then it's over. But in Orthodox worship, we ourselves, and I don't know if the Syriac liturgy says this, so I could be only giving credit to Coptic liturgy where I shouldn't be. We understand creation as God's gift, right? You look at Genesis and you see a narrative that says God creates human beings for no real reason other than that He loves them. There is nothing God can stand to benefit from creating people. God's not going to get any stronger, He's not going to get any bigger, He's not going to have a better reputation. He is the all in all. And there's nothing He benefits from making humans. He just does it because He's love. Now, if you know anything about the ancient world, at this time, in the ancient Near East, it's sort of in the same geographic region as where the Israelites are telling their stories, there are a bunch of other creation narratives. One of which is something like the Enuma Elish. Now, all those other creation narratives share something about why their God created people. One of them, for example, involving Marduk, suggests that Marduk kills another god and he's going to do battle with all of these other gods that are warring against him. And he thinks, you know what, if I'm battling, I'm going to be hungry. And if I'm in the middle of war and I'm hungry, I might as well have someone to feed me. I'll make people. And so in that creation narrative, which is near contemporaneous with Genesis, I'll make people why? Oh, so that they can feed me when I'm hungry, so I can have slaves, personal attendants. In comes Genesis, and it's like, there's none of that. That's why in the Psalms you see the Lord say, if I was hungry, would I tell you? He doesn't need humans to feed Him. He doesn't need people to give Him sustenance. He doesn't even need the worship and praise that we offer Him. Right? And so God completely gifts human being their creation, and He makes them out of nothing. I'm going to skip this quote so we don't go too long. That was from St. Cyril, but I know we're behind, and I'm going to make us more behind probably, so I can't do what I was going to originally. We see this sense, if you're listening to St. Paul in the book of Acts, that God is our life, that we have no life apart from Him. And St. Gregory the theologian tells us even our very next breath is God's gift to us. So St. Paul in Acts, this is the altar to the unknown God at the Areopagus, if you remember that episode. And he says, I'm going to tell you who the unknown God is. And so he says here, therefore the one whom you worship without knowing, Him I proclaim to you, God who made the world and everything in it, since He is the Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is He worshipped with men's hands as though He needed anything, since He gives to all life, breath, and all things. And He has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on the face of the earth, in the hope that they might grope for Him and find Him, though, this is the part I want you to pay attention to, He is not far from each one of us, for in Him we live and move and have our being, as some of your own prophets have also said, for we are also His offspring. Now, in the modern world, we live as though we're detached from God. We live as though God does His thing in heaven and we do our thing here. I'm here, I'm hanging out, I'm going to work, I'm paying taxes, I'm buying a house, I'm whatever, I'm asking a girl out on a date, whatever. And God's, He's managing His affairs up there. And St. Paul tells us, in Him we live and we move and have our being. St. Gregory, like I said a few seconds ago, says every breath depends on God. All that we are, everything that we have, even our very lives, are God's free gift to you and to me. And if we understand that properly as Orthodox Christians, suddenly we understand all the more so why sin brings forth death. right? If you remember, what Satan tells Eve is not, like, don't worry about God, come start this like new hedge fund or something. Right? He says to her, you will not die. You remember, she says, we're going to die if we even touch the tree and so on and whatever. He goes, you'll not die. God knows in the day you eat of it, your eyes will be open. You'll be like God, knowing good and evil. So the woman saw that the tree was good for food and that it was pleasant to the eyes and desirable to make one wise. She took of its fruit. She also gave to her husband with her, and he ate. So you imagine God says, the day you eat of the fruit of this tree, you shall surely die. And then Eve is told, no, you're not going to die. It's okay. Don't worry about this. In fact, what's going to happen is you'll be as God. You won't need him. You'll be okay. You're doing your own thing. It's like the North American dream. You're going to be self-made. You're going to be fine. And what does Eve do? She goes, okay, great. That thing gives power. This, by the way, is the first time that somebody other than God in the book of Genesis has called something good. God creates stuff and he calls it good. And then in the fall, what we see, in God's creation of Eve, we see God say that it is not good that man shall be alone. This is the first time somebody other than God says something about whether the world is good or not. So Eve takes things into her own hands. She says, what matters is how I feel about it. I'm going to do me, I'm going to create my own reality. A narrative that we think about a lot in Lent is that of the prodigal son, right? So the prodigal son goes to his dad and goes, hey dad, pretend like you're dead, since that's when inheritances are gifted, right? To me, it's as good as though you were dead, so give me my stuff. Okay? And we all know the narrative, and he comes back and so on. This is what Adam and Eve do in sin. Right? God, you're dead to me. I'm dead to you. I don't want anything to do with you. You could say, properly speaking, that in an Orthodox understanding, the fall is really a rejection of communion, a rejection of the marital bond that God is making between a human being and himself. The Syriac fathers love the image of the bride and the bridegroom, to think about God's relation to humanity, to think about how God has wedded all of humanity to himself. They talk about it more than any other tradition really does. And what we see here is the real problem with sin is not so much that you broke God's rule, right? It's not so much that God didn't want you to do something and then you did, and like my 6-year-old breaks my rules at home and I punish him and so on. This is way deeper than that. This is way broader than that. This is, do this and you'll have life. Or you say, no, I'd rather die. Look, I'd rather not be alive. I'd much rather enjoy this pleasure of mine. That's what sin is. That's why the Old Testament and the New, right? But starting from the very beginning of the Old Testament, you have tons of things that are like, look, I put before you life and death, choose life. And human beings are like, I don't know, I'd rather have the golden calf. I'd rather marry these foreign peoples. I'd rather be attached to all of these other things. St. Basil summarizes this in talking about what human beings have done in the fall, and he says, to the extent that Adam withdrew from life, he likewise drew near to death. For God is life, and the taking away of life is death. Therefore Adam prepared death for himself through his withdrawal from God, in accord with what is written, behold, those who remove themselves from you are destroyed. Thus God did not create death, but we brought it upon ourselves by wicked intention. So when we think of the relationship to God, right? He doesn't want us to die. That's not what he made us for. The Wisdom of Solomon in the 2nd chapter says exactly this. God made all things that they might continue existing. And we say, like the prodigal does to his own dad, I don't really want this. I'd rather attach myself, have a relationship with something different. I'd rather addict myself to some other substance. If you want to understand this in a shorthand, you could say that sin in the tradition is understood as a destructive mode of being. A way of being that isn't just an alternative. No man, I'm going to do me and live this kind of life. You do you and you do the religious life. Sin is this mode of being that destroys who we are. If God creates you, if He is the originator, and He says, look, here's the plan. Here's how I made you. Here are the blueprints. And we say, I don't want that. I want to live for me instead. The only thing there left is death. If God shows us that even though it may hurt us in the time, even though it may be difficult, the weight of virtue is what we were made for, because it's how we're going to be purified and made one with Him and with each other. And we say, no, it looks way easier to live for pleasure or greed or power or whatever, then we're destroying ourselves. This relationship that we have with our attachments is killing us. And God says, look, it's right here. Pursue this reality I put in front of you. You know, an analogy I stole from somebody I use is if you have a car and you said, no, I really wish that it would run on milk instead of gas, go put milk in the tank. Now your car is dead. Do you then go to the maker of the car and say, no man, you didn't let me be free enough to put whatever I want in the tank? Of course not. So I used to do a public opinion poll about this because I thought it was simple and clear as to what it is, but I'm not going to ask because it's too big a crowd. I googled the word angry man for this, okay? This is apparently anger. This is where talking about the passions becomes relevant. Because the passions are the things that nag at us, that call us, that seem to influence our action, that stop us from being able to be with God or with each other properly. Right? So, this word, passion in English, comes from a Greek word, pathos. The Greek here implies suffering. So, anybody ever take a course called pathology? Or pathophysiology, or something like this? Yeah. So, pathology literally means the study of disease or the study of suffering. Because the passions are those things that seem to act on us in ways that influence our behavior that we wouldn't normally want them to. This is St. John Chrysostom's description of this. He says, on the soul alone comes the injury when one is angry or envious or whatever else of this kind one does. And then he says, or rather suffers. For in fact, it is not an action, but a passion, not a doing, but a suffering, to be angered, to feel envy. Therefore, indeed, they are called passions of the soul, even wounds and bruises, for it indeed is a suffering and worse than suffering. The point here is that the passions are the things that act on us in ways that we would normally not want them to. So, for example, I use anger all the time because we all know what it's like to lose our temper. We all know what it's like to freak out on somebody. If you're younger, it's your mother. If you're older, it's your spouse. You know, that kind of thing, unfortunately. And it's one of your best friends if you're in between those phases. But we know that there are times where, like, you lose your mind on somebody. You've shouted at them. You've even gotten up in their face. You've just totally lost it. Now what happens? A few hours later, a day later, a week later, a month later, you go, why did I do that? Why did I lose it on them? Why would I ruin a 10-year friendship over that stupid thing and I lost my mind on them? And then you go and you say things like, I don't know what got into me. My bad, that wasn't really me, right? And on one level, literally like it was you. You stood there, 5'10", you shouted at me. That was you. At another level, what we mean when we say things like, I don't know what got into me, is there seemed to be some sort of voice or force or something that really, really pushed me to lose it with you. And we know what it's like when you sit there and you're fuming, right? And then you get the thoughts and you're like, and they did it on purpose. And last week when they did this thing, they did the same. And they've been giving this message all month. And you know what? They've been like, everything's going wrong in this person and so on. And like, all that's happened is they didn't, I don't know, pay you back for the restaurant you went out to or something. And suddenly you're like, there's a whole narrative in your mind. That's what the passions are. That's what the tradition has always understood the passions to be, in the sense that they've taken a context where, like, if you weren't upset, you might have been like, oh, it's all cool. That person just, I don't know, they can't hang out right now. Or they're in a bad place. Or they're just upset about something. And instead, we become controlled by this thing like anger, for example, and we lose it on that person. And so in a sense, we become completely enslaved to the force of this passion that now acts on us, instead of us being in control. That's why the passions are so important when it comes to understanding relationships, not just to God, especially to God, but also with one another. Why we react to each other in ways that we wouldn't normally. Why we become controlled by things that we say, no, I was going to stop that. I said I wasn't going to keep doing that. And here I am again. That's what the tradition has always understood as the passions. The list of the passions that is most commonly used in Orthodox circles comes from the 4th century ascetic Evagrius. And what he did is he said, look, from being in the desert with the fathers, my understanding is that no matter how complicated your context, no matter how upset, miserable, addicted, whatever you are to something or to someone, it comes down to one of 8 basic things. And that's how he framed it. Anybody here go to a Catholic school growing up? So what does this look like? 7 deadly sins, right? So the 7 deadly sins emerged from this list as an adaptation of it. Evagrius doesn't understand them as deadly sins. He's not saying these are really, really bad things. He's saying these are the 8 most basic things. You'll see here, later in the West, from John Cassian through Gregory the Great, basically these get adapted. Gregory in the West says, look, sadness and acedia are the same thing, so they became sloth. Pride and vainglory got joined as just pride. He added envy, that's how you get 7 out of 8. So the 7 deadly sins list, which also started as just capital sins, like where sin begins, that's developed longer over the West. It's a very different idea than these. These are like, you want to understand where you're addicted or attached? It goes to the root of one of these things. That's how we understand this list. Now, I just have to check the time so I know we're not like super overboard. When Evagrius makes this list, he's an interesting guy because Evagrius is not one of the saints' stories that you hear where you're like, oh, that guy, like, he was born in the church, he read books in the church, he remained in the church. You know these stories that you hear and you're like, that guy's not me, right? Like, I had a past, I'm whatever. Evagrius is a guy who was a reader with Saint Basil the Great. He was his disciple. Then he went to Constantinople to be a deacon, because he was with Gregory the theologian there. And while he was an ordained deacon, as many of you know, when you're ordained to the diaconate, you don't marry after that if you're not married. And if you are married, you don't remarry, right? Like if you're a deacon with diaconal responsibility, like you don't do these things. And Evagrius was a guy who, at this time in his life, had an at-a-distance love affair with a noblewoman. They were writing each other letters. Things were getting heated. And he dreams one day that he's in prison and he's about to be tortured to confess to his crime. And an angel humiliates him, shows up and goes, my Lord Deacon Evagrius, why are you here? He goes, look, I get it. I know, this is my fault. I did this because I shouldn't be, like, this is my fault. It's on me. I am too attached. I'm having this illicit relationship with this woman. So he tells the angel, just give me a day to pack my clothes and I will leave Constantinople forever. Constantinople is the ancient capital at the time. And so he does. And he ends up at the Mount of Olives with Melania and Rufinus. And it said he was good for a few weeks, and then he started to wear all of the fancy clothes he brought from the city with him, and he started to speak in a way that was lofty and haughty. And then he becomes sick, and the elders of the monastery, Melania, goes to him and she goes, this isn't bodily, this is divine. You need to go to the desert. And so she tells him that he has to go to the deepest part of the desert called Kelly at the time. What he does while he's there is to learn from the fathers there and to pursue the monastic life. And he says, this list I synthesized: gluttony, lust, greed, sadness, anger, acedia, vainglory, and pride. All I did was to summarize the wisdom of those who came before me. That's why he made the list. Because he found it a handy diagnostic for people to be like, put your life up against these. Where are you attached? Where is this affecting your relationships? So the list starts with gluttony, right? And you go, I don't know, maybe you're not gluttonous, maybe you're in good shape, maybe you run, maybe you don't go out to eat at an all-you-can-eat buffet before Lent or whatever, as we Copts do that. But gluttony in the desert was always understood as being way more than just about food. Food is the most basic element of gluttony. But gluttony is a problem of consumption. Right? The gluttonous person looks at the world and says, not here's God's gift to me, but here's a thing made to satisfy my desire. This is an Eastern Orthodox author, Jean-Claude Larcher. He says, gluttony consists of a true perversion of the essential end goals of food, which is to be consumed Eucharistically, since in this passion, man wishes to delight in food in itself apart from God, instead of delighting in food in God and in God through food. By means of food, he erects a barrier between God and himself, instead of utilizing it as a support in elevating himself to God. The desert says that gluttony is way more about looking at the world as a plaything, as a toy to satisfy you, than it is just about eating too much. If you go to a fancy 5-star restaurant, you don't eat too much, Like they come out, they bring you the one shrimp and they call it some sort of upper whatever, hors d'oeuvre or something. And it's fancy and you've paid an exorbitant amount of money for it. But you're not you've not been to an all-you-can-eat. That's still considered gluttony. And the reason to talk about sin first is to say gluttony is not because God hates fat people, right? Like too often we get this kind of thing wrong, like God doesn't like it when you're not in good shape or something, Oh, God wants you to be like, I don't have a six-pack. Gluttony is way, 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 way more than that. Because God creates food that we might use it as a means to commune with Him. That's why the ultimate meal is the Eucharist. Food was always meant as a bridge between God and man. Gluttony turns food into an object of worship. This is what I live for. This is what I'm attached to. Gluttony is the first passion in the list, because what comes next, lust or fornication, is a product of gluttony. So if you've ever went to your spiritual father, Sabun, I'm really struggling with lust, and he goes, fast. And you're like, no, wait, you missed, what are you talking about? I told you what do you mean? And that's what the desert would have said. If you went to any of the desert fathers, Antony the Great, Macarius, Pachomius, whoever, and said, Father, I struggle with lust, he would have said, eat less. And you're like, what? And the desert's like, yeah, because you're so used to seeing everything as being about satisfying you. You're so used to seeing the world as a thing that is meant to please your fancies, that unfortunately you now started to see your neighbor, your brother or your sister in Christ, as also made to please your fancies. Right? And that's how the desert understood lust. Lust is a byproduct of gluttony just because it's still consumption. It's still you racing through things that you're now consuming for your own benefit. or you think. That's why these passions directly affect our relationships with one another. Unfortunately, if you're the gluttonous eater, this will take its course. The next passion is greed. Greed is an extension of the first two things, because if you think the world is about consuming, even so much you consume your neighbor, the next thing after that is that you start to want to consume everything, and you see when somebody else has something you don't, that kind of envy when you like put on steroids by social media. Now suddenly, like, you're like, that's mine. I should have had that. I could have done a better job. I should have a 6-figure salary. I should be the person promoted, so on and so forth. And that kind of greed is a byproduct of seeing the world this way. Seeing the world as a thing to be eaten or consumed. Right? If you see food in the lens of Eucharist, the things that God offers us, that we offer back to Him, and He gives us life from it, then you suddenly see all of this in a different way. Sadness is the one after this. People struggle with sadness as a passion because they're like, that's so mean, why does God get upset if I'm sad? But it's not about, again, how God feels about it, it's about the design. And Evagrius says, one who flees all worldly pleasure is a citadel inaccessible to the demon of sadness. For sadness involves the frustration of a pleasure, whether actually present or only hoped for. If we have an attachment to some earthly object, it is impossible to repel this enemy, for he sets a snare and produces sadness precisely where he sees we are particularly inclined. How often has somebody let you down in your life, and you're like, I hate that guy, how could he have done this, why did she say that, so on and so forth. What the fathers tell us is like, maybe you're too attached to something. Maybe that's why that's ruined your relationship. Maybe you struggle with this sadness inside of you that makes you sit there and wallow and imagine all these things about the person, and you find every one of your friends who will sit there and wallow in your misery with you, but all the people who are like, bro, just like snap out of it, you remove them. In that stage of our spiritual madness, right? Sadness tells us that you were wronged, that you deserved this, that this person should have known that you wanted that this is the way you must be treated. This is your dignity, this is your honor, this is whatever, right? And we become controlled by this. So that the frustrated pleasure, the thing you expected and said, this is my right, suddenly comes to control you. The other source of sadness, Evagrius tells us, comes from the thoughts of anger. I don't know about you, but it's very easy for me to understand how anger and sadness are tied. Because in somebody like me, they turn into each other. Somebody does something to you, and you become all mopey and dejected and sad, and the next day you wake up and you're just irate. You're like, how dare they, bro? How could, I don't understand. What's this person even thinking? And how don't they understand this? And if they only knew what I did for them last year, 58 weeks ago at 3:32 on Friday afternoon, this guy wouldn't be such a, and so on and so forth, right? All that internal dialogue starts to totally control us. And better yet, control how we deal with each other, right? I skipped anger because the list I had given you was like, I had already started with anger as an illustration, so you'll forgive me for that. I thought that this was an interesting aside because I was proud of myself for finding this picture. It's a little bit late to use the picture, but it is what it is. The society you and I live in, right, the consumerist society we live in, suggests to us that greed is actually kind of normal. Like, if you want a new phone, if you want to go to the fanciest places, if you want to eat whatever new thing that you could experience, whatever it is, maybe I have to hold it. I'll try. I don't know, I've been fiddly with it, it's my fault. That all of this is normal. And so there's this text I thought was really intriguing. Greed becomes a modern way of life after the Industrial Revolution. So you guys, like, we think it's normal now. A new iPhone comes out every like 8 to 12 months, and it's like, it doesn't do anything. It'd be like, oh, there's an extra megapixel. Look, there's a new hole at the back where the camera is. You know, like, I need the new phone. What if I can't see all the lines on the leaf next time I take a photo? You know, no, hey, the new phone is slightly slimmer. Okay? And? You know? But this is part of Western society. So this text here says a huge gap between production and consumption was the result of 19th century industrial revolution, as we produced more cereal, cigarettes, and other products than we could consume. Instead of cutting production, manufacturers sought to increase consumption, to increase demand, to meet the supply. But that would require teaching consumption as a way of life. Consumption as a way of life is the modern world. Right? Unfortunately, like, the way we live today, things are meant to be eaten, consumed, and thrown out. Ask any of your parents or grandparents, hey, when you bought furniture, you know, like I do this, I'll be like, Teta, when you bought furniture back in Egypt, did you expect it to break after a decade? She'd be like, no. If they made it to break, then they're worthless as a company. Teta, the fridge you bought when you were married 60 years ago, does it still work? She goes, yeah, I checked on it last year when I visited Egypt. I'm like, my fridge stopped working after 6 years, man. I had to get a new motor, whatever that means. You know? But the world is this thing today that completely tells us things are meant to be eaten, consumed, thrown out. Right? Consumed, tossed, get something new. What do you think that does to relationships? Hey man, you and the girl, you've been dating for a few months, the chemistry's off, just go to the next. You guys went out on a couple dates, it's not very fresh anymore. Move on. Go find somebody else. You know, I tell all the COVID couples, they were the lucky ones because, like, one, they got to save on their wedding. That's a totally different topic. But two, these couples would be like, Peter, it sucks, man. All I can do is, like, we can drive around together, but there's nowhere else to go. I'm like, that's awesome. Imagine all you could do is talk together and, you know, just like be real. Instead of the couples who've been too busy getting on helicopters and, I don't know, doing Maid of the Mist together, like to actually be with each other. They were so busy consuming experiences that they don't even know what each other is about. You know, all those COVID relationships where all they could do is like go to a drive-through, grab a coffee, and then sit in a car for 2 hours and chat. I'm like, you guys are so lucky. Because that's real life. But those couples were forced to encounter their relationship being quote-unquote boring to begin with, right? They were like, it's not all that exciting. We can't go downtown to a fancy restaurant. We can't go to a sports game. We can't whatever. And they confronted the reality very early. A lot of us in pursuing a relationship, we realize things get stale at some point. We're like, oh man, maybe that means it's not real. That's because of this mindset. Because we treat people like they're meant to be consumed and experiences like they're meant to be had. If you look, the way the fathers see this is they look at the Old Testament and they say that journey that Israel goes through is very much an indicator of our journey in the spiritual life today and every day. So the fathers like to point out, a lot of us will have an experience of leaving Egypt at some point in our life. You know, if the Israelites are enslaved by the Egyptians, much to my chagrin, you know, and they escape by a wondrous, miraculous act, a lot of us will have something one day where it's like God intervened in my life in a way I didn't expect. God, like, just everything lined up and everything is great and I could never have expected it. And so we get fired up, right? Either we visited a monastery, we had a youth retreat, we had a job, whatever it is. We get this thing and we get fired up about our spiritual lives, like Lent starting. And then after a few weeks, we're like, man, it's kind of boring. It's a little bit dry. What happens to the Israelites? Don't forget, that's exactly their journey, right? Egypt, they're freed, they crossed, like, the whole sea was moved for them, all this stuff. It's like within a few weeks, they're like, bro, we had more food in Egypt. You know? That's why gluttony is at the head of the passions, by the way. Hey man, like, we're gonna die here. Okay, watch, bread's gonna rain from heaven. Cool, bread from heaven is like that's crazy, right? If you're there watching bread rain down from heaven on a daily basis at a set time, you're like, that's crazy, it's miraculous. What happens a few weeks later? Dude, there was meat in Egypt. Okay, fine, quails. Enough quails that it's going to come out of your noses. All right, but it's kind of getting boring out here, and so on and so forth, right? And the fathers are like, that's not just Israel, that's you and me. That's our spiritual lives every day. Where you're like, I did the God thing, I'm trying to pray, I'm like, I don't know, sort of into it, I do quiet time a lot, but I don't feel different yet. And we do that with God, we do that with relationships, we do that with a lot of things. And like often people pursue careers and are like, oh man, it started to get boring. I thought it was going to be like changing lives every day, and now it's dry, and I'm going to change my major, or I'm going to quit careers, or I'm going to whatever. This is the instability of the modern Western person, right? Where we're like, nothing is set, nothing is stable, we're not going to stay committed to anything. And that's why these passions are so important to think about, because what is it that we're ever going to be able to pursue if when things are dry with a person, when consumption isn't working with our jobs, when we don't feel like we're feeling God enough, we're going to say, nah, forget it, I'm going to quit. The reason your grandparents stayed or remained or became Christians was because they were like, I'm going to remain even though it sucks. Even though sometimes the burden is hard. The reason they stayed married was not because they were like, I wake up every day so jacked up about seeing your grandfather in the morning. Right? It's because they were like, marriage is about sacrifice and love. I look at the cross and I see the ultimate example of love, and I'm like, that probably wasn't pleasant. Maybe that's what love is really about, and not lust, and not greed, and not gluttony, and consumption, and so on and so forth. Now I have to do a time check because I went on a tangent that I wasn't planning for. Were we supposed to have ended, Celine? Is this like are we over already? I don't know. Sorry? We need time for Q&A. Is that code for stop talking? Okay, hold on. Let's get to the end then. We're not going to do these slides. I will say two things about vainglory. Everybody thinks of pride and vainglory as the same thing. Vainglory is the addiction to the praise of other people, right? And pride is at the point where you don't even care what other people think about you. That's why Satan is prideful. He's not looking for other people to affirm him. He knows he's all that in a bag of chips, in his opinion, right? Most people who say they're prideful are struggling with vainglory. They want the admiration of praise in people. This can be, by the way, an attachment to, I walk into a room, I want everybody to notice me. This can also be the person who can't leave their house without looking at themselves 1,000 times and then asks their friends if they look okay for like the rest of the evening because they want to make sure everybody sees them in a certain way. So vainglory is very much pervasive, and it's a shapeshifter. I'm not going to do this for you, but I'm going to read you this, okay? And then we'll call that the end. The way to understand the structure of the human being in the tradition is that God creates us with three parts. We have a reason, actually it might be we have a reason, we have a desire, and we have a spiritedness, or it's called irascibility, but call it a temper. And basically these three things are naturally made by God to be in human beings. So that the reason, which is named after the Logos, is meant to perceive God in all things. The desire is meant to be oriented towards God and not towards neighbor. And the irascibility, or our temper, is meant to be aimed against sin and not against our brother. And so this is St. Basil the Great's description of this, and then we'll call that the end for now. St. Basil tells us that the soul's faculty of temper, or irascibility, is useful in many of the acts of virtue. It can be an ally to reason against sin. If your temper is not roused against the evil one, so this is if you don't hate sin, right? Orthodox Christians are not called to be nice and fluffy people. We're called to hate sin and wage war against it. He says, if your temper is not roused against the evil one, you will not be able to hate him as much as he deserves. For I hold that it is necessary to have an equal zeal for the love of virtue and for the hatred of sin. For by the way it is used, each of the other faculties becomes either evil or good for the person who possesses it. For the soul's faculty of desire, one who uses it for the enjoyment of pleasure and the consumption of impure pleasure is disgusting and licentious. That's Basil's words, not Peter's. While one who turns it towards the love of God and the longing for eternal good things is enviable and blessed. And again, as for the rational faculty, one who handles it well is prudent and intelligent, while one who sharpens his mind for the harm of his neighbor is a worker of mischief and evil. So we'll go here. The basic summary of the last piece here is just to say that God creates people with a desire. Everybody wakes up one way or another and they desire something, even if it's just peace, right? For some people it's money, for some people it's pleasure, for some people it's nothing. They just want to be left alone. That's still desire. And He's made Himself fulfilling that in you and I. He's made us, rather, for being filled by Him. And this temper of ours is made to fight against the sin that seems to invade us. And so for the church fathers, you and I, even if it doesn't feel like it, we are innately made for God. We are innately made for virtue. All sin that seems to invade my life and my relationships is actually the byproduct of a warped virtue. That's why the greatest of the saints were the worst of the sinners. When you see somebody like Saint Mary of Egypt, who went one day to the great church to go and to seduce people, right? Saint Mary of Egypt wasn't just happy to seduce people in her small town. She went to go find many people on religious pilgrimage. But it's the same woman, when she realizes, oh, my desire was never meant to be filled this way. She's the one who could be found alone for 17 years by Abu Zosimus and say, I'm just happy with God. I now found what I was seeking, and I was looking in all the wrong places. So if we feel chained, if we feel addicted, if we feel stuck in our way, in the things that we have attached ourselves to, that's not a sign that we're hopeless, right? In fact, actually, that's a sign that God has something great that He's going to work out in you through that thing. That's why we go visit our Father of Confession, we talk to Abuna, we attend service, we do our spiritual reading, so that we can reorient these things and fix them, so we can finally deal with each other and with God in love.